then the more we can understand about emergent order and what leads to emergence, the better chance we have of facilitating cultural change. Now, we're still discovering stuff about emergence. It's only relatively recently that people have been studying it in any serious way. And this is one of the first things that seems to be true, is that emergence only occurs when a system is critical, whatever that might mean. An example of a fairly simple complex system, a thought experiment. Imagine a dropper, and it drops grains of sand one at a time. What happens? You get a little pile of sand on the floor, don't you? The pile gets bigger and bigger and bigger, yeah? Because, well, at least it gets bigger and bigger until it reaches a state, a critical state, self-organized criticality, as it's known technically. And then it changes. Then, when you drop a grain of sand on it, it might just get a bit bigger. Or you might get a little avalanche. Or you might get a big avalanche. When it's in that critical state, it's no longer possible to predict what will happen when you drop a grain of sand, because any one of those things is possible. Now, there are some rules, and the rules seem to be that you get a lot more little avalanches than big avalanches, and you get more big avalanches than you get huge avalanches, and that these follow a mathematical law, a rule. But what you don't know and what you can't predict is what's going to happen as the result of any given grain of sand. Now, there's anecdotal evidence, no more, that a similar sort of thing happens in organisational life. That when an organisation is in a critical state, when it is change ready, if you like, then it's quite easy actually to have some kind of change initiative, and things do happen and a new culture does emerge. The question is, what might lead an organisation to be in that state? Because I don't know about your experience, but my experience of change initiatives is that most of them actually don't have much effect. Emergent order happens by itself. When it happens, it happens. As I say, you can't predict what's going to happen when you drop the grain of sand on the critical sand pile. You can't direct it, you cannot make it happen in a particular way. You can't say, I want this to be a big avalanche. But in human systems, as opposed to piles of sand, there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that we can influence the direction in which change occurs. So we can't direct it and plan it, sort of nice and neatly, but nor do we simply leave it to chance. There is a middle way. And lastly, when a pattern has emerged, it is itself quite resistant to further change. Well, obviously the culture you currently have has emerged at some time, and it now is resistant to change. So it's quite hard getting over that kind of hurdle. You can't just say, I think we'll have a new culture tomorrow. It's not going to happen. Lots of organisations, people talk about silos. And what they mean are islands of connectivity that are disconnected from other islands of connectivity. Well, that's not a good recipe for emergence. It's not a good recipe for emergent change. So one of the things one might want to do in an organisation is help build better connections. Another thing which seems to be absolutely key in all sorts of different systems, not just human ones, is diversity. The more diversity in the system, the more likely it is to be able to change. Some people talk about a possibility space. They talk about increasing the possibility space. It's a metaphor, but it's not a bad one. The more possibilities you have available to you, the more likely you are to be able to find a combination of them that leads to some kind of effective and emergent change. So this is not just kind of an HR thing, and this isn't equal opportunities. This is equal opportunities and much more. It's about bringing all the diversity we have into the organisation, or much more of it. Culture often doesn't allow you to bring sometimes most of your personality into work. A lot more we could say about that. There's a lot to think about in terms of diversity and how to increase it in any organisation. There's something about information flow and resource flow. If it's too slow, you're less likely to get emergence. If it's too fast, you're less likely to get emergence. It's a question of getting it right. Then there's some specifically human stuff which seems to affect emergent change in organisations. The stuff about anxiety. Working in an organisation is quite an anxious thing. You've got responsibilities, you've got people depending on you. You've got huge responsibilities for the South East of England, for goodness sake. If that doesn't produce anxiety in you, then you're not kind of functioning properly. But if it does produce anxiety in you, how do you manage that anxiety? Often we manage anxiety by becoming bureaucratic, because that we feel that we've made this sort of unmanageable system manageable. The trouble is, lots of the bureaucracy we bring in doesn't help, except it makes us feel better. And so maybe we need to look at how can we manage anxiety effectively rather than ineffectively. There's something about power. If the power in an organisation is disproportionately distributed, then change is unlikely. In other words, if most of the power is vested in the hands of a very few, change is not so likely. Unless you go into a complete sort of fascist dictatorship, when you will change, or it also seems to be the case that if power is completely evenly distributed, change is not very likely. So we need some differentials of power, but they don't necessarily have to be permanent differentials. They can actually vary, but they do need to be some, but they mustn't be too great. And the sense I get of your adaptive leadership program is that part of that is about trying to ensure that the way power is distributed in the organisation is more appropriate. If I'm wrong. There's something about identity. We don't, that saying, I don't mind change, but I don't like being changed. There's something about, I need to cling on to my I am not the same person I was 10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago, but I am the same person that I was as well. I have that sense of identity, even though I know I've changed. And so if I feel my identity is being threatened by somebody, I'm just going to resist. I'll come with you, but don't force me. And so there's something about keeping identity in organisational change, which doesn't always happen. And people do feel very threatened, unnecessarily perhaps, but they do feel very threatened and therefore very resistant. There's something about intent. It doesn't have to be positive intent, in fact, it can be negative intent. I'm going to talk a bit more about this when I talk about something called appreciative inquiry. But there is quite a lot of evidence that suggests that organisations change in the direction in which they inquire. If you look for problems, guess what you'll find? So there's something about the nature of the intent we have in human organisations. There's something about boundaries. It's important to have boundaries. Boundaries facilitate creative change. It's one of the roles of a leader, I think, is to maintain boundaries, not blindly or kind of fascistically, but nevertheless to lay down some clarity, to say, this is where we want to go, this is what you cannot do, now you do whatever you think is right in pursuit of these goals. Because you know what you can't do, anything else is permitted. There's something around positive emotional space. This comes originally from kind of relationship counselling. Research suggested that relationships where there's a preponderance of positive comments about absolutely anything, not just darling, you were lovely this morning, but it's a lovely day outside. Where there's a preponderance of positive comments, the relationship is much more likely to be stable. Where there's a preponderance of negative comments, this house is awful, it's really getting me down, they're much more likely to break up. Similar sorts of things have been found in organisational life. Organisations where the stories people tell, the conversations they have around the water cooler or wherever, if those are positive, there's a very good chance that in a commercial organisation there's a healthy bottom line. And lastly, and the hardest of all, is waiting. You had to wait for that pattern to emerge from the simulation. You often have to wait for cultural change to happen. And that's really hard, because it might appear that nothing's happening. But that's why I put expectant waiting, because sometimes you get a sense that something's going to happen. I know I sound a bit like sort of toning out West Side Story. Something tonight going to happen. But you do get that sense, and sometimes, particularly for senior managers, they just need to hold their nerve, and that's really hard. I whipped through that because I want you again to answer the same question, but this is the way you're going to do it. One of you is going to volunteer to stay at your table. Everybody else is going to move to different tables. So we're going to increase the diversity and the connectivity as well. Because even if you're working with people you now know well, that's why I said to Norm, it doesn't matter if you sit with people you know well now, because in round 2 you probably won't be. And then the person who stays at the table just kind of hosts the conversation by saying, this is the sort of thing we were talking about, and just summarise what's on the tablecloth. And then, of course, the conversation just continues, because someone will say, oh, well, at our table we were. So, one stay, everyone else move.